Hello everyone, welcome to SwitchUp. In today's video we're going to be having a look at the game that's just about to release on the Switch 1 and Switch 2, being Final Fantasy Tactics: The E-Release Chronicles.
We're going to go over the Nintendo Switch 1 and 2 performance of the game. There's a few interesting things there, as well as the two versions, the Enhanced and Classic.
Yep, so you'll get the Classic version as part of the deal regardless of which of the two you buy. So there's a fair bit to listen out for in this video if you're of two minds as to whether to pick this up. So what's it all about? Well, let's find out.
From the main menu, you can choose either the Classic or Enhanced versions of the game, with the Classic having the traditional 4:3 aspect ratio, but it does use the new dialogue, is that correct?
Yeah, it does use the translation from the War of the Lions version of the game, which released for the PlayStation Portable. But anything else that particular version included, there were some extra bits that made their way into that game, aren't included here. This is strictly the classic 97 original game, albeit with that updated translation.
Okay, so let's have a look at some of the changes for the enhanced version. The biggest one, perhaps, is the fully voice-acted dialogue and the enhanced script.
Yeah, so this uses that War of the Lions translation as well, so you'll see the exact same wording across both versions now. But as Mark mentioned there, the big difference is the fact that you have voice acting within this enhanced version.
Kill them all! Leave no man standing!
You would have us slaughter them. Are you mad?
There are many changes related to gameplay as well. So for example, you do have a brand new UI. This also integrates a tutorial into the first stage or so that as you naturally use an ability, it basically tells you how to do that.
Yeah, if you go from playing the enhanced straight into the classic or vice versa, you will notice these changes. The classic is definitely of its time, and that's not to criticize it, but it was definitely an era where hand-holding wasn't as prominent and you learn on the job, and if that meant dying, then so be it. The enhanced version, whilst keeping the same flow and difficulty to a degree, does make sure you know what you're doing in those early stages.
Okay, so let's break down how that actually transpires. So for starters, you've got 3 different difficulty modes. These can now be changed at any time that you're not in battle, so between stages. Before you even enter a round where you're getting your troops ready, placing them down, that's where the first major change comes.
Yeah, if you're a veteran of this series and you played the original back in the day, you won't even think about. But for example, the original made it quite easy for you to make mistakes. Like when you put your troops together at the beginning of a battle, you could enter a battle with just your one main character if you didn't press L or R to introduce the others to the battlefield. The enhanced version makes it much more difficult for you to make these rookie mistakes. Yeah, you'll notice again if you play the two versions, little changes like in the first couple of battles in the original, already the enemies were healing themselves up, whereas that takes a while to transmit if you're playing on the normal difficulty. Even at that level, the game just gives you a moment to breathe before it starts to have things like that happen.
Yeah, it does, and it carries over into the gameplay as well, whereby previously it was quite easy to actually attack your own units, and it wouldn't give you any visual feedback to that. Now you've got a very distinct color scheme that takes place, even highlighting your own units in a different way.
One of the best changes, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that you can now hold down ZR, I believe it was, to have a proper bird's eye view of the battlefield. This made it so much easier to put your troops exactly where you wanted them. In the case of the levels themselves, you know, the models of the buildings being in your way, when you press ZR on the original, it tilts ever so slightly, but never to a degree where it really alleviates this problem.
As well as that, you can hold down the R bumper button to speed up the battles. You can actually just fly through the enemy's turns. Another of those quality of life things that does make a big difference, especially in some of the longer battles where you're waiting for multiple enemy units to take their moves.
Amongst the list of new features, it also includes auto-saving during battles. I'll be honest, I didn't notice this happen. I never had a need for it to play out for me in the enhanced version, but I did die in the original and it took me back to the start of that battle. So yeah, it's clearly a feature that has been added this time round. And one final point to make before we look at the visual side of it is that you cannot transfer your save data from classic to enhanced or vice versa. Just bear this in mind before deciding which of the two to start with.
Moving towards the other visual changes then, there are some big differences here. So the original is based on the PlayStation version of the game when it comes to the look of it. And you can tell that it looks like a 640 by 480, 4:3 aspect ratio experience stretched over the screen. I think it still holds quite a bit of charm, and there are some changes there, aren't there, with things like the intro cutscenes.
Yeah, the intro cutscenes has that classic FMV. That's what would have been used back in the day, whereas this time round, for one of the early cutscenes, they go for this quite lovely hand-drawn animation, which really does make the game pop, especially if you've played the original. It's something you'll notice right off the bat.
Yeah, I think that cutscene, it's really nice to see them not just go for a very high-resolution, modern FMV, and to go for something that actually has a bit of style to it. It just shows the overall love that they've put into this project.
It also makes it very clear very quickly that this is a proper remake, you know, because had they gone for, as you say, just a high resolution FMV, you would have seen the differences, but it would have had more of a feel of a remaster to it potentially. Let's look at the visuals from a more artistic point of view now. And the original game had sprite characters, of course, with 3D backgrounds or towns, you know, locations for you to fight within using polygons to build up the buildings and whatever else you would have had within those stages. This time round, they've gone for, I don't know, quite an interesting style. It's quite heavily pixelated, but in a very modern way. It almost looks like paintwork on a canvas because you can almost see the individual pixels coming through the color.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to quickly mention the first game, and I do like the fact that they've kept a lot of the janky moments that you'd have on PlayStation. For example, when the camera rotated in a 3D game that used pixels as well, you'd get this kind of judder, like it was this classically PlayStation judder that you would have. There was a name for it, I remember seeing a video on it, but that's still intact, and there's actually a bit of charm to that. With the modern version, like you say, still having to create that pixel look whilst running a much higher resolution, they could so easily have just not. They could have just had the whole thing look very flat and smooth. I'm glad they didn't.
In some respects, it almost reminds me of something like Super Mario RPG, but with one of the Yoshi games that went for that kind of painted style, not the handcrafted ones they make these days. You kind of have to see it to know what we're talking about. But even things like, if you look at the background on the original, where obviously they didn't want to use space that they needed elsewhere, so it's just a plain background. But in this one, again, they've gone for that pixel look. And if we zoom in here, you'll really notice it. It does, again, it looks like it's been painted onto a canvas because of it.
Some other visual changes that you will see between the two versions are things like text. So the new version has a modern text style, which I don't necessarily prefer, but it is clearer to read. The portraits haven't seen a huge amount of change, and I actually quite like that.
Yeah, they've definitely been smoothed out. We talked about it being heavily pixelated, but not in such a way where it looks blocky, which is what the portraits on the original looked a bit more like. And you mentioned text there. I do agree with you. It's definitely easier to read this time round. It would have been nice to see them stay with that style, but just do what they've done with the rest of the game and use more pixels to make it a bit clearer, rather than go for the modern text, which does lose a bit of the charm.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's nice to see some visual changes that affect gameplay, like the on-screen turn order on the left-hand side of the screen. The height map actually says height now on the top right. Just little subtle differences that make it a more enjoyable experience to play.
Let's move on to frame rates now. So we're going to look at the frame rate of the original game, which is on both Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions. Then we're going to look at Switch 1 and Switch 2 specifically. So in terms of the original game, it's quite an interesting story behind this, because the art director has come out years later and stated that for him it was a non-negotiable that the original game ran at 60 frames per second. And one of the reasons for this is because Square had another game in production at the time, the name of which I forget, but it was a fighting game that ran at 60, and he'd seen this and was so influenced by it that he wanted this game to run at 60, even at the detriment of some of the gameplay mechanics that they had in mind. For example, they wanted to have parties of 10 characters, but had to reduce this down to 5 to keep that 60 frame rate. Quite interesting, a game such as this, where you wouldn't think frame rate would be as big an issue, they push so hard for that.
Yeah, and that does carry over into what they've done here with the Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions of the enhanced game. Now, this is a game where you've got animations running at a lower frame rate, and then you have the actual movement of the camera running at 60, and I think it is confusing the software we're using a little. When we've been playing this, it feels like a flawless 60, but when you look at the frame rate captures, whether you're looking at the Switch 1 version over here, you can see all kinds of stuttering going on, but then when we look at the Switch 2 or some of the Switch 1 where the camera moves, all of a sudden the frame rate smooths out. So I think what's actually happening is it's running at 60, but it's tricking the frame rate software a little.
I think what might back this up is if you look at this level here where you have rain coming down and there's a lot of flashes as well, lightning I believe is going on, you can see those jumps as we mentioned, whereas if we look at this level where you don't have any such effects, you can see the software is showing a much more consistent 60.
Other changes that I know we're going to be asked about. Things like on the Switch 2, does it have mouse mode? Sadly, it doesn't have mouse mode. Now, I think you feel like there's something they definitely should have added, right?
I do think this would have added to the game. I think it's a perfect game for any company to implement what's a very clever feature of the Switch 2. It does feel like a missed opportunity, and even the fact it doesn't have touchscreen controls as well is a strange exclusion. But for me, it's that mouse mode. When obviously if you're buying the Switch 2 version I'm talking about, just because it's such a new and unique feature that I do feel more companies should make use of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the control changes that they have made are sensible ones, as you mentioned, with the camera differences, because those are the ones that really impact gameplay. But yeah, just an odd omission for sure. In handheld, everything carries over nicely as well. Now, we've mentioned it doesn't have touch screen, which is a shame, but it does look nice here. I will say I think OLED looks better because of just the way that that technology works.
Aside from that though, the game is running at 720 on the Switch 1 in handheld and at 1080 on the Switch 2. I will say personally, I don't think there are many massive differences between the two versions, Switch 1 and Switch 2. The official blurb mentioned frame rates and resolution, and obviously we've covered the resolution just now. Now obviously this is just an initial preview of performance and the differences between the two versions. Perhaps when we get into a full review, which will be next week, and later into the game, we may see where that improvement in frame rate comes in.
Yeah, and with the resolutions docked, you would imagine native across both platforms, but like Glenn said, because of the style, you really aren't going to be able to tell.
So there we have it, that's our performance review of the Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions of a classic game. Hopefully you'll now know some of the new features if it is one that you are interested in, but like I said, do keep a lookout for our full review next week where we'll dive further into things and obviously give it a score. Thank you to our patrons and our channel members for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.